How does the richest man in Los Santos end up in the trunk of his own car? The inside of the trunk is a black, not dark, black. The kind of black that pushes back against your eyes, that makes you uncertain where your hands are and where the walls of the space end. The leather of the trunk floor carries a specific smell, expensive car smell, the kind of smell that costs more to achieve than a cheaper car costs to buy, and underneath that smell now is blood. The car moves steadily. The engine runs smoothly. It turns over with the unhurried confidence of a machine that has never had reason to doubt itself, and the road underneath sends small, regular vibrations up through the floor of the trunk, a rhythm that under almost any other circumstances would be the kind of rhythm you fall asleep to. From the front seat, music is playing. A radio station, Los Santos Rock Radio, the signal strong and clean and threading back through the body of the car. The man in the trunk can hear it. It is, he would tell you if asked, his favorite station. He is not going to be asked. His hands are tied behind him. His mouth is covered. The shirt he was wearing earlier this evening near the pool of his Tongva Hills mansion before the evening took its turn is torn at the collar and stained across the front. He is bleeding from a point he cannot see and cannot reach. The bleeding has slowed, which is something, but the area around the wound has begun to stiffen and ache, which is something else. He has been asking questions into the dark since the trunk closed. The driver has not answered a single one. The driver of the car is Trevor Phillips. The car's license plate, which neither the driver nor the passenger in the trunk can currently see, reads Monid. The name of the man in the trunk is Devin Weston. He is 51 years old. He has, depending on which source you consult and how much skepticism you apply to self-reported figures, a net worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $12 billion. He owns stakes in hotel chains and alcohol brands and real estate companies and a private military firm whose soldiers are currently not protecting him because those soldiers are either unconscious or gone. He has an interest in a film studio he tried to destroy for insurance money. He has a website that lists both his net worth and his penis measurement with the same confident font and equal pride of place. He has, he would tell you, 6 black belts, which he announced at the opening bell of the Borsak Stock Exchange in 2009 for reasons he found adequate. He has an ashram. 2, actually. He has, in the language he prefers, the clout to end careers in Washington. He has told people this. He was not bluffing. None of this is helping him right now. The drive has been going long enough that Weston has moved through several emotional phases. The first was disorientation, the specific confusion of a man who was standing at his pool one moment and was in the trunk of a moving vehicle the next. The second was calculation, the trained reflex of someone who has spent 30 years turning bad situations into leverage. The third was something closer to actual panic, though Devin Weston would never have used that word for it. And the fourth, the one he has settled into now, is a grim, grinding pragmatism, the same quality that made him a billionaire, adapted to the dimensions of a car trunk, still trying to find the angle. He has offered Trevor Phillips a position in his organization, a real position, authority, salary, resources, the kind of offer that would change the life of most people who received it. Trevor has not responded in a way that suggests he considers his life in need of changing. Outside, through the body of the car, the landscape is shifting. The city has fallen behind them. The lights that never quite went off over Los Santos have thinned and separated and given way to the dark, and the road they are on is climbing now. Weston can feel it in the lean of the car, in the way his weight settles harder against the back wall of the trunk. They are heading north, into the hills, into the wilderness. His own radio plays for him from the front seat. We need to go back, to understand how someone ends up here, bound and bleeding in the trunk of a car with a license plate that reads Monid. You have to understand how someone builds a life like Devin Weston's, what it means to make $12 billion before the age of 50 and treat every human being you encounter as a variable in an equation. what it costs, not to you but to the people around you, and what happens when the people around you stop accepting the terms of the equation. But before we leave this moment, stay here a second longer, in the trunk, in the dark, with Los Santos rock radio playing from the front seat, indifferent to everything happening behind it. If you are settling in for the night, you are in exactly the right place. More stories like this one are waiting on this channel. Consider subscribing if you haven't, because the best way to not miss what comes next is to already be here, now. Back to Devin Weston. The car slows briefly, a turn, a road that narrows, then continues its climb. The surface beneath changes subtly. They have left the highway. Whatever road they are on now is older, less maintained, the kind of road that goes somewhere specific rather than somewhere general. He tries again. He says toward the front of the trunk that he is a reasonable man, that there is a figure, a number, that would resolve whatever misunderstanding has brought them to this point. He has access to accounts, offshore accounts which have always been, in his view, the intelligent financial choice. He can make a call. The number is flexible. He would like to discuss the number. Trevor drives. The call goes unanswered the way his previous calls into the front of the trunk have gone unanswered, not with silence exactly, but with a specific quality of inattention that is worse than silence. Trevor is not ignoring him the way you ignore someone you are carefully not responding to. He is ignoring him the way you ignore music playing in a room where something else is happening. Weston is ambient. He is background. He is Los Santos rock radio. He tries to think of what he hasn't offered yet. He has money, genuine, accessible money, in accounts that can be reached with a phone call, and he has the phone in his pocket, which his hands cannot reach. He has connections, government connections, the kind that have ended careers in Washington, and those connections are reachable by phone if the phone were accessible, which it is not. He has the kind of leverage that comes from knowing things, the specific knowledge that he has accumulated over 30 years of operating at the intersection of finance and government and crime, the information that people in his position accumulate about the people around them, and which serves as a residual insurance policy. He thinks about whether any of this is accessible right now from inside the trunk of his own car. It is not. He has, at this moment, his voice and his mind. He has been using both. The voice has produced sentences that Trevor has driven through without acknowledgement. The mind is still running, still looking, with the trained persistence of a man who has spent decades finding angles in situations that appeared to not have them. The mind is the last resource. He is using it. The car crests something, a ridge or a rise, the body briefly leveling before the descent begins, and through the metal of the trunk, Weston can feel the quality of the air change. Cooler, salted. The Pacific is close. He knows where they are going. He has known for a while. There is only one reason to drive north out of the city into the wilderness at this hour with this cargo. He has known, and he has been constructing offers anyway, because Devin Weston's relationship to impossible situations is that he continues working them. That is what 30 years of financial survival looks like from the inside. It does not stop when the situation appears to be over. It keeps running. The car stops. The engine keeps running, idling in the dark. And through the thin body of the trunk, he can hear, at some distance, the sound of another car arriving, then another. He knows who is coming. He has one more offer to put together before the trunk opens. This is where Devin Weston ends. Now let's go back to where he began. He was born in 1962. The details of his early life are thin. Weston rarely spoke about his family, his childhood, the geography of wherever he came from before he remade himself. What he offered the world instead was a finished product, a mythology of the self-made man, polished and sealed, presented without the rough edges that early lives tend to leave on people. You could learn about his investments. You could read about his fund. You could study his Life Invader page and construct a silhouette of his personality from the artifacts he left there. But the boy before the billionaire, he kept that somewhere quiet and private. What we have is a college degree. In 1984, Devin Weston graduated from San Andreas Community College with a major in theater and musical therapy. He graduated magna cum laude. The Latin phrase means with great distinction. It requires in most institutions a grade point average that places you comfortably in the top tier of your graduating class, earned through years of consistent attendance, engagement, examination, and the kind of sustained academic effort that most students experience as one of the more difficult things they have ever done. Weston achieved it without attending a single lecture. He has confirmed this himself on multiple occasions with the specific pride of someone who views the fact as a demonstration of intelligence rather than a character flaw. He figured out the system at 22 years old, not just how to pass it, but how to excel within it by finding the gaps in its architecture. He learned what was actually being measured and where the actual evaluation happened and what the connection was between his performance and his grade, and he worked those connections without doing the thing the system nominally required. He graduated with distinction from a program he never enrolled in the practical sense of the word, the degree itself, theater and musical therapy. This is worth thinking about because most people, when they hear it, laugh. And then they stop laughing because the degree, the specific combination of disciplines, is not a joke or a random choice or an accident of curriculum. Theatre teaches you how performance works, how a body in a room communicates with other bodies, how the gap between what you present and what you are can be managed and shaped and made useful, how an audience forms a relationship with a figure on a stage, and what it takes to maintain that relationship over time. Musical therapy, at the overlap with theatre, studies how rhythm and pattern and sound affect how people feel, how they breathe, how they think, how receptive they are to what is being offered. Devin Weston spent his professional life performing. He performed being reasonable when he was not. He performed being a spiritual man while practicing the opposite of every spiritual principle. He performed being a friend to people he was robbing and a partner to people he intended to discard. He understood the relationship between a figure in a room and the people receiving that figure, and he managed that relationship with precision. His degree, without him attending, turned out to be deeply relevant. A year after graduation, in 1985, he made his first $1 million. Then he spent it in a week. Most people hearing this assume recklessness, a 23-year-old with more money than sense burning through a windfall in 7 days. But recklessness is not the only reading. The other reading, the one that makes more sense given who he became, is that the first $1 million was an experiment. He made it, and then he used it to learn what money was actually for. Not to hold, not to store, to move, to convert, to deploy. $1 million sitting in an account is $1 million. $1 million in motion is a mechanism. He spent it in a week, and then he went and made more. The real money came through what he would come to call the tech bubble years. The late 1980s and the 1990s were a specific kind of fever in American economic life. The internet was beginning to exist in practical terms, and most people didn't know what to do with that fact. The established money was cautious. The institutional investors were skeptical. The venture capital world was interested but uncertain. Weston was none of those things. He saw the wave forming before it crested and positioned himself in its path, not with the careful diversification of someone managing risk, but with the directional certainty of someone who had decided what was going to happen and wanted to be in front of it. He invested in internet companies when they were, for most investors, still in the category of interesting ideas rather than financial instruments. He made money. He reinvested. He made more money. He also invested in acai berry. This is the detail that seems smallest and is probably the most instructive. The acai berry is a fruit from the Amazon basin, dark purple, harvested from palm trees, consumed in South American communities for generations without particular notice from the global market. In the late 1990s, a combination of factors, growing consumer interest in functional foods, the beginning of what would become a health and wellness industry of enormous scale, and the specific cultural appetite in California and the American West for premium nutritional products from unusual sources made acai a potential market commodity. Most business people in 1998 did not see this. Weston saw it early enough to get in, position himself, and exit with a 9-figure sum from a berry. A 9-figure sum from a berry, before the acai smoothie bowl became a menu item at every breakfast restaurant in Los Santos. His ability to see markets forming before other people recognized them as markets, this was the real skill, not intelligence in the abstract, not work ethic, though he could work when work was required, the specific talent for spotting the moment before the moment when something becomes valuable. In 1997, he rode the bull till it split, his own phrasing borrowed proudly. The markets were climbing through the late 1990s, the dot-com bubble in its inflation phase, the paper wealth multiplying faster than any underlying value could justify. Weston was long through the rise. He made money on the way up. In 2001, he fleeced the bear till it bled. The bubble broke. The Nasdaq lost most of its value. Ordinary investors, people who had trusted the direction of the market to hold, watched their portfolios collapse. Weston had repositioned. He had structured himself to profit from the collapse, the same way he had profited from the rise. He made money on the way down, too. This double-sided profitability is what separates a wealthy person from someone like Weston. Most people who make money in financial markets are directionally committed. They make money when things go up, or, if they're sophisticated, when things go down, but rarely both with equal competence. The person who can profit from either direction is not invested in the health of the system. They are invested in volatility, in motion, in the fact that things change. Whether the change is upward or downward is a technical detail. He established the Weston Alpha Fund and based it in the British Virgin Islands. He called this tax efficiency. The rest of the world calls it offshoring. The distinction, he felt, was a matter of perspective. His perspective was the one that mattered since it was his money. From 2004 onward, he began what his own materials described as bankrupting companies. More companies than hot meals he had eaten since that year in his direct count. He would later go on a raw food diet in 2009, which adds an additional layer of specificity to that particular boast. A raw food diet means he was eating, just not cooking it. The number of bankrupted companies was presumably very high. The bankrupting of companies is not the same activity as the failure of companies, though the end state looks similar from the outside. Companies can fail because they made bad products or miscalculated their market or ran out of cash during an expansion that moved faster than their revenue. These are failures. What Weston did was different. He identified companies that had value in a specific configuration, assets, intellectual property, a workforce, a market position, and he acquired positions in them and then reorganized that configuration until the value had been extracted and the remaining entity was worth less than its debts. This is called many things in the financial industry, most of them technically accurate and none of them conveying the experience of working for a company that Devin Weston had identified. People lost jobs. They lost retirement savings. They lost the years they had invested in an institution that they believed was real in the permanent sense and turned out to be real only until someone decided it was more valuable disassembled. None of this was illegal. He would tell you so. He would tell you so warmly, with the Darwinist framework available if you asked for it, and the spiritual framework available if you seemed like someone who would receive it better. He called himself an adventure capitalist because adventure contains the implication of risk accepted, of outcomes not guaranteed, of someone who goes into situations willingly rather than being carried into them. The companies he acquired did not choose to be acquired. The people in those companies did not choose to be inside an Western investment vehicle, but he was the adventurer in the story, and they were the terrain. The marriage is harder to place. We don't know when it began, or who she was, or how they met, or what he was like in the years when he was still someone who might have agreed to be a husband. What we know is the end point. She received $135 million in the divorce settlement. That is the number, $135 million. He called it cheap at the price. He did not mean she deserved more. He did not mean he was being generous. He meant that whatever the marriage had cost him, in time, in distraction, in proximity to a person who had claims on his attention, the $135 million was worth paying to be free of it. He was buying his way out of a situation he had decided was not worth maintaining. The same logic he applied to companies he'd invested in that stopped performing. The same logic he'd apply to employees, to relationships, to anyone who became more expensive than they were useful. The divorce settlement tells you something about the scale of what he had built by the time the marriage ended. $135 million is a significant number even in the context of $12 billion, and the fact that he described it as cheap suggests the settlement came at a point in his career when he had already moved well past that scale. It tells you something about the duration of the marriage, which was probably substantial given the settlement value. And it tells you something about the quality of his legal team, which was the best money could retain, and which still ended up at a number that he described as, if not fair, at least manageable. $135 million, cheap at the price. The woman who negotiated that settlement, or whose attorneys negotiated it on her behalf, understood Devin Weston in at least one dimension he underestimated. She knew that for him, money was the thing he would give up rather than continue a situation he wanted to exit. She priced the exit correctly. He bought the house on Buen Vino Road in Tongva Hills sometime in the years that followed. He bought the beach house. He arranged the 2 ashrams. He began the raw food diet in 2009, the same year he hired Molly and claimed his black belts at the Bao Sac opening bell. He started jogging. He began posting on Life Invader with the specific frequency of someone who has decided that public self-presentation is a form of management, that what you say about yourself regularly enough becomes the primary narrative. He built a persona. The distinction between Devin Weston and the persona of Devin Weston is the kind of distinction that requires years of sustained self-construction to erase. Early in his career, he was presumably aware of the gap, aware that the adventure capitalist, spiritual seeker, wellness practitioner was something he was building onto himself from the outside, a layer of presentation rather than an expression of genuine character. Most people who do this kind of construction retain some awareness of the architecture. They know they are performing even when the performance has become habitual. At some point, gradually, through the accumulated momentum of behaving consistently within the persona, through years of other people receiving the persona as real and responding to it as real, and therefore making it real in all the practical senses, the awareness drops. The construction and the self become the same thing. The man who graduates magna cum laude without attending a lecture, who makes his first million and spends it in a week to learn what money is for, who built a hedge fund and an offshore structure and a private military stake and a film studio scheme. That man and the man who does 20 miles before breakfast and attends benefit workouts and posts photographs in a namaste pose become indistinguishable. By 2013, he had been living inside that persona for long enough that he had forgotten it was one. That forgetting was going to cost him. By 2013, Devin Weston had not just made money, he had built a structure. This distinction matters. Money alone, even $12 billion of it, does not produce the kind of untouchability that Weston operated with in Los Santos. Money is the foundation, but what sits on top of it, the network of companies, the government connections, the private security apparatus, the cultural positioning, that is where power of the Western variety actually lives. He had spent the better part of 20 years constructing that architecture with the same deliberate, patient attention that his investment career demonstrates he was capable of when the target was worth the effort. Let's walk through what he owned. The headline holding was Merryweather Security Consulting. Weston held 11% of the company, a minority stake, technically speaking, but large enough that he commanded the company's soldiers as though they were his own private military force. Merryweather was run by Don Percival, a former military man who had built the firm into the largest private security operation in San Andreas. Real soldiers, real equipment, real capacity for the kind of work that governments couldn't officially authorize and private citizens couldn't officially request. Mercenaries, in plain language, armed, trained, and deployable. Weston's investment was not passive. He used Merryweather the way a man uses a tool he owns, without particular concern for whether the tool found the use appropriate. He dispatched their soldiers to run personal errands. He called on them to clean up problems that arose from his business activities. He expected them to be available at any hour and for any purpose, because he was a shareholder and the concept of his needs being outside the company's scope was not one he had spent much time entertaining. Don Percival, who ran the company and therefore managed the human beings who actually did these things, did not enjoy this arrangement. He was a professional. He had built Merryweather into what it was through years of hard and specific work, and he had a certain pride in the institution, the kind of pride that comes with believing in what you have built, even if what you have built is a mercenary firm. Weston treated his creation as a convenience. Percival resented this quietly and said nothing, because Weston held 11% of his company and the leverage that came with it. He filed the resentment away and waited. The timing of the investment tells you everything. Weston bought his stake before Merryweather received authorization to operate on domestic soil. He bought in when the company was valuable, but not at its most valuable, when the domestic contracts were still pending, when the upside was theoretical. The moment those contracts came through, the value of his 11% climbed dramatically. He had known the contracts were coming, the kind of intelligence that tells you a private military company is about to receive government authorization for domestic operations does not come from reading public filings. It comes from the kind of relationships with federal agencies that Weston had cultivated through years of exactly this kind of infrastructure building. He had Steve Haynes. He had people inside the FIB. He had the clout, to use his own word for it, that reaches into rooms where decisions about private contractors are made and turns the decisions in the direction he needed them to go. Beyond Merryweather, his portfolio ran wide and strange. The Banner Hotel and Spa chain, Dynasty 8 real estate, the Vanilla Unicorn Gentlemen's Club, Patriot Beer, No-Go Vodka, Debonair Cigarettes, the Die Already film franchise, a gymnasium called Pump and Run, a juice bar named Squeeze One Out, a sportswear label called Lobon. He held shares in the San Andreas Lotto. He had an interest in the Tequila La nightclub. He had some claim on a taco chain, and his website, his official public-facing website at devinweston.com, listed holdings that may or may not include, in his exact phrasing, the country of Greece. The country of Greece. He listed this with neither explanation nor irony. In the same section as his hotel chain and his vodka label may or may not include Greece. The website was its own landmark. Devin Weston maintained bedevinweston.com with the attention of a man who believed sincerely that the world would be improved by understanding him better. The site listed 2 personal facts about himself with equal prominence, in the same font, with the same confident formatting: his net worth of $12 billion and his penis measurement, which he gave as 9 inches. He appeared to believe both were equally worth communicating. He appeared to believe they were equally credible. Whether either figure was accurate is a question the reader is left to navigate alone. His Life Invader page, the in-world Facebook equivalent, was a running document of his inner life, offered without apparent filter. I ran 20 miles before breakfast, then skipped breakfast. The golden rule, nothing over 21 unless it's vintage wine or a vintage car. Another honorary macroeconomics PhD, yawn, just completed 5 multi-million transactions whilst meditating. I am now literally trading in my sleep. Another assistant bites the dust. If I tell you no complex carbs in the office, I mean no complex carbs in the office. Always do unto others as you would do unto your staff. He had a photograph on the page in a namaste pose, hands pressed together at the chest, eyes cast directly at the camera, the expression of a man who has achieved inner peace and would very much like you to know it. The pose is technically one of humility and receiving. He managed to look down at the viewer from within it. The Life Invader posts are worth dwelling on because they are not random noise. Each one is a calculated public utterance from someone who has thought about what it means to present themselves to an audience and has decided deliberately on exactly this register. The 20 miles before breakfast, discipline, physical superiority, the implication that his body is as optimized as his portfolio, the skipping of breakfast, self-control, the willingness to deny even the rewards of effort, the complex carbohydrate policy, authority over his working environment, the absolute clarity of his standards, the message that his professional space obeys his wellness philosophy or it does not survive. The PhD joke, intellectual status performed through casualness, the communication that academic recognition is something that accumulates around him through no particular effort on his part, exactly as his college degree did. The trading while meditating post is the most revealing. He is describing himself as a man for whom business and spiritual practice are not intention but are the same activity. He's not pausing his financial operations to be mindful, nor is he managing his mindfulness sessions around the demands of the market. He is doing both simultaneously and doing both better than other people do either separately. This is the fantasy he was selling, not just to his followers, but to himself, the man who had transcended the ordinary human requirement of choosing between things. Always do unto others as you would do unto your staff. Consider what this sentence actually says. It is a rewriting of the Golden Rule, one of the oldest ethical principles in the human tradition, to center the employment relationship as the template for all human interaction. Do unto others as you would do to people you are paying and therefore own a piece of. It is not certain that he noticed what he had done with the sentence. It is not certain that he would have cared had someone pointed it out. He had somewhere between 40 and 60 employees at any given time across his various operations. His turnover rate was high enough that he posted publicly about it with a frequency that suggests either an unusual rate of attrition or a specific threshold of tolerance below which retention became someone else's problem. The complex carbohydrate post is believed to have followed the dismissal of a personal assistant who brought a bagel to a morning briefing. This has not been verified. It is the kind of thing that is not difficult to believe. He described himself simultaneously as a Darwinist and a spiritual person. These identities lived in his mind without apparent friction or awareness that they might be intention. The Darwinism was for the money, the belief that what he did in markets and business reflected a natural law, and that natural laws don't require moral justification. The strongest take the resources. This is not cruelty, it is physics. The spirituality was for the yoga, the raw food, the ashrams, the rhetoric of mindfulness and presence and intention. He liked what it said about him to the people he moved among in Los Santos, that he was not merely rich but evolved, that his wealth was the product not just of calculation but of elevated awareness, that he had arrived at his position through some alignment of mind, body, and market timing that lesser people simply hadn't achieved. He attended benefit workouts. He appeared at charity galas. He spoke about wellness. He positioned himself publicly as someone who cared about the world, or at least as someone who had learned the vocabulary of caring and could deploy it in conversation. The 2007 financial crisis requires its own moment. On his website, Weston claimed personal responsibility for it. His version of events, he had been positioned in financial markets in a way that left certain open positions that needed to be closed before a specific deadline. He failed to close them because he had departed for a volcano kite surfing trip to Nicaragua. The failure to close those positions cascaded through a series of mechanisms he described without particular specificity into the 2007 global financial crisis, the housing market collapse, the credit crunch, the bank failures, the global recession that cost tens of millions of ordinary people their jobs, their homes, their retirement savings, all of it, traceable, in his telling, to a trip to Nicaragua where he went kite surfing near a volcano. He said this on a public website with his name on it. Whether the claim is true, false, partially true, satirical, or some fourth thing that doesn't have a clean category, he never clarified. What matters is that the option he chose when considering how to discuss the worst financial catastrophe in a generation was to claim authorship, not to deny involvement, not to apologize, not to remain silent, to announce it casually as a fact he found worth sharing. The kind of man who, asked whether he was responsible for enormous suffering, chose to say yes, and then note that the trip apparently was worth it. His daily routine by 2013 was structured around the performance of wellness. He woke early. He ran 20 miles by his account before breakfast. He skipped breakfast anyway because consuming food after the effort of running it off would represent a kind of moral inconsistency he was not willing to live with. He did yoga. He owned 2 ashrams, to which he apparently traveled occasionally enough to count them as assets, but not frequently enough that they influenced his day-to-day schedule in any visible way. He attended meetings in athletic wear when he could get away with it, not because he was coming from or going to exercise, but because athletic wear was the wardrobe choice that most clearly communicated physical discipline and the specific kind of casual superiority that comes from being confident enough in your position to not dress up for it. He conducted business calls during meditation, because multitasking in that context signaled an efficiency that mere single-tasking people couldn't access. He attended benefit events, charity functions, wellness retreats. He appeared at gallery openings and film premieres and the kinds of public occasions that demonstrated cultural engagement without requiring him to actually be interested in culture. He had, he claimed, 6 black belts. He announced this at the opening bell of the Biao Stock Exchange in 2009. The disciplines in which these black belts had been earned were not specified. The verification of this claim was not offered. He mentioned it because it contributed to the picture, a man who had mastered not just financial markets and spiritual practice and philanthropic positioning, but also, apparently, multiple martial arts to their highest publicly rankable level. He described himself as both a Darwinist and a spiritual person. These 2 identities coexisted in his mind without apparent friction or awareness that they might be in tension with each other. The Darwinism was for the money and the business, the belief that what he did in markets was an expression of natural law rather than personal choice, and that natural laws do not require moral justification. The strongest take the resources, the weakest provide them. This is not cruelty, it is the order of things. The spirituality was for the yoga and the ashrams and the raw food and the rhetoric of mindfulness and presence and intention. He liked what it said about him to the people he moved among, that he was not merely rich but evolved, that his wealth was the product of something more than calculation, that he had arrived at his position through an alignment of mind and body and market timing that lesser people simply hadn't managed to cultivate. The 2007 financial crisis is worth a moment of careful attention because the way he talked about it tells you something specific about the way he related to consequences. On his website, Weston claimed personal responsibility for the 2007 global financial crisis, his version of events. He had been holding certain market positions that required active management, and he failed to manage them appropriately because he had left the country for a volcano kite surfing trip to Nicaragua. The failure cascaded. The cascading produced, Through a sequence of events he described without particular interest in the mechanics, the 2007 financial crisis, the housing market collapse, the bank failures, the credit crunch that spread through the global financial system and cost, in aggregate, hundreds of millions of people their economic security in ways that some of them are still dealing with. He put this on a website with his name on it, not as a confession, not as an apology, as a boast, as a detail worth sharing about his life and career. He had been so large in the markets that his momentary inattention, brought on by a vacation that involved kite surfing near an active volcano, which is either a genuine adventure capitalist activity or a piece of personal mythologizing, he decided sounded appropriately extreme, had been sufficient to collapse the global financial system. Whether this is true, false, partially true, or something he decided to say because nobody with the authority to contradict him was going to show up and do so, he never clarified. What matters is the choice. When presented with the largest economic catastrophe of the modern era and the question of his relationship to it, he chose to claim authorship, to say, "Yes, that was me," and to say it without any apparent concern for what claiming it might mean to the people who experienced the consequences. He also, in the evening, went to the Vanilla Unicorn. He had an ownership stake. He felt this justified the visits. He had a house on Buenvino Road in Tongva Hills with a pool, a gate, professional-grade security infrastructure, and 8 Merryweather soldiers on rotation. He had a beach house somewhere along the Chumash coast. He had 2 ashrams that he referenced, but apparently visited infrequently, given how much time he spent in Los Santos. He drove a black Tornado on most days, not the flashiest car he could have driven, but one that communicated money without the obvious ostentation of something Italian. His license plate read, "Moneyed." Whether this was a joke at his own expense or a sincere expression of his identity is something the plate is not equipped to answer. His favorite radio station was Los Santos Rock Radio. He liked it enough that it played in the front of the car while he was in the trunk. And then there was Richard's Majestic. He had invested in Solomon Richards' film studio because of a calculation, not because he liked film. He was, by his own statement, entirely indifferent to film as a medium, noting that people now preferred to video themselves on their phones. He invested because of what film studios look like when they fail. An insurance policy on a producing studio pays out when a film cannot be completed. A studio reaches its peak investable value when it has something significant in production, when there is a completed project that has not yet been distributed, when the product exists but hasn't been monetized. This is the moment when the gap between the studio's value and the insurance payout is largest. Get in at peak value, manufacture the inability to complete the production, collect the payout, exit. He had done versions of this before. He would explain it to no one, because explaining it would require acknowledging what it was. The structure Weston had built by 2013 was impressive in the technical sense. It reached into the government through Haynes. It reached into private military through Merryweather. It reached into finance through the Alpha Fund and his portfolio of holdings. It reached into entertainment through Richard's Majestic. It reached into Los Santos' cultural life through his visible philanthropy and his wellness positioning. He had designed it to be comprehensive, to leave no angle unaddressed, no vulnerability uncovered. The flaw in the structure was not financial. It was not strategic. It was human. Not one person inside it was there because they wanted to be. Percival resented him. Haynes used him as a resource the way you use a battery, with no expectation that the battery has an opinion about the arrangement. His employees lived in fear of the complex carbohydrate policy. His investors were purely financial. His charity contacts networked at his events and moved on. There was one exception. One person who had made a genuine choice, for reasons that were not primarily financial or instrumental. Her name was Molly Schultz. In the early summer of 2009, Devin Weston attended a benefit workout called Resistance Training for Rwanda. The event was the kind of event that occupied a specific niche in Los Santos social life, high-end, wellness-adjacent, charity-branded, attended by people who believed that being seen exercising for a good cause was a meaningful contribution to the world. Weston attended these events with regularity. He had the vocabulary for them, he had the body for them, given the 20 miles before breakfast. He fit. He spotted Molly Schultz across the room. What he saw, what made him decide, in the span of however long it takes to assess a stranger at a benefit workout, that she would be working for him, is not recorded. We know he headhunted her there. We know that by the time the event ended, the decision had been made. Whether he explained this to her as an offer or announced it as a fact is a question the available sources don't answer cleanly, though given Weston's general conversational style, the probability distribution leans in a particular direction. She took the position. Molly Schultz was, during the events of GTA 5th, somewhere in her early 30s. Beyond those broad parameters, much of her biography before Weston lies in shadow. The game gives her to us almost entirely through what she does, and what she does is work for him. She wore a navy blazer with a white blouse beneath it. She wore glasses with thin frames. She wore black heels and dark trousers, and a watch with a white face on her left wrist, and a pendant on a chain that she never took off. She was precise in her dress, precise in her movements, precise in her communication. She was, in short, everything that Weston was not, which made her useful to him in the most immediate practical sense. She was the instrument through which his imprecision was made operational. When Weston decided he wanted 5 luxury cars stolen and delivered to a drop point near Palito Bay, Molly Schultz handled the logistics. When he needed his legal affairs managed, the Merryweather contracts, the Richard's Majestic investment documents, the Western Alpha Fund's holdings in the British Virgin Islands, the endless private legal machinery of a man whose holdings spanned industries and jurisdictions, Molly managed them. When his police connections needed to be activated to provide an escort for their convoy through the city, Molly activated them. She was able to call on a police escort for business operations, which tells you something about the relationships she had developed within Weston's network of influence. She had moved through those relationships until some of them became hers. She was, by any objective measure, brilliant. Weston himself said so later, though not with the precise generosity you might expect from a eulogy. She was the operational heart of his Los Santos work. The gap between his appetites and what the world could actually deliver was wide, and she spent her professional life bridging it, translating the things he wanted into the specific actions required to produce them, managing the people and the logistics and the timing that stood between intention and outcome. She tried to flirt with Trevor Phillips during their first formal meeting at the Alta construction site, where Weston laid out the car scheme to the 3 protagonists. Trevor responded with aggressive and anatomically specific enthusiasm that Molly shut down and ignored. This is the most unguarded moment she has in the game, a flash of normal human behavior, a woman in a professional context testing whether a person she found interesting might be worth the effort, and then she put it away and went back to being Weston's attorney. The moment is easy to miss because it is brief and because the game moves quickly past it. But it tells you something important. Molly Schultz was not a character without interiority. She was not merely a function in Weston's operation. She looked across the Alta construction site at Trevor Phillips, and she thought for a moment that she might be interested, and then she decided the moment wasn't right, and she set it aside. That capacity, to notice, to want, to decide, is the same capacity that kept her at Weston's side through everything he asked of her. She was capable of genuine decisions. She was making one continuously, every day she stayed. After that, she is always Weston's instrument. The car missions ran through her on the logistical side. Franklin would steal the vehicles, Trevor would provide aerial support when needed, Michael would play whatever role the plan required. But the briefings came from Molly when Weston couldn't be bothered with direct contact. The confirmation of deliveries went through Molly. When the Cheetah and the Entity XF were dropped at Hayes Autos, Molly was there to receive them and explain that payment was conditional on the remaining vehicles. When the Z-Type arrived at the LSIA hangar, Molly was there. She wore the same precise expression in every operational context, the expression of someone who had made peace with the nature of the work and did not find it worthwhile to revisit that peace in the field. It was Molly who stood at the Procopio truck stop near Palito Bay when the Packer arrived with all 5 cars loaded on it. It was Molly who delivered the news that Weston had invested their payment. She did this with the specific composure of someone who has rehearsed the delivery of bad news until it registers not as bad news, but as an update, a logistical detail that requires brief communication and no further emotional engagement. Franklin called Weston directly afterward, furious. Weston answered, told him the payment was invested, wished him namaste, and ended the call. Molly was already gone. She was, in the practical sense, the face of Weston's worst impulses, the person who said the things he found tactically useful to not say himself, the intermediary between his decisions and their impact on other human beings. She was aware of this, presumably, as she stayed anyway. And this is what matters most about Molly Schultz, the thing the game does not underline, but that sits visible in every scene she appears in. She was not there for the money, or not only for the money. She was not staying because she had no better options. A lawyer of her evident competence, working inside the infrastructure the Weston had built, had access to opportunities that did not involve arranging the theft of rare vehicles for the Chinese government. She stayed because she had committed herself to the project of Devin Weston. She had decided at some point during or after the Rwanda benefit workout that this was where she was going, and Molly Schultz was the kind of person who did not revisit her commitments once they were made. The Rwanda benefit workout, actually, consider it. Resistance training for Rwanda. It is a charity event structured around exercise. The people attending it are the kind of people who go to charity events structured around exercise, which is a specific demographic. Wealthy, health-conscious, philanthropy-oriented in the performative sense that the event itself represents. People whose relationship to suffering in distant countries is mediated through a gym membership and a good cause. Molly was there, she was in that room, and Weston spotted her. What did she make of him? In that first conversation, at that first event? He was already successful, already positioned in the money tier that the event's attendees represented. He was charming in the way that people who have learned to be charming are charming, precisely, instrumentally, with the specific calibration of someone who knows how to make the person they are talking to feel seen. He probably offered her something real, the actual quality of her work, recognized immediately, offered a role that would use it. She was brilliant and she knew it, and here was someone saying, yes, and here is what that gets you. She took the job. Whether she knew what she was walking into is the question the game leaves open. She was a lawyer. She understood contracts, understood what the obligations were, understood the structure of what she was being asked to participate in. She may have known from the beginning that Weston's operations ran in the grey area and beyond it, and she decided that was acceptable, or she discovered it gradually, over time, as the operations became more specific and the grey became darker, and by the time she understood fully what she was part of, she had already committed to it in ways that were difficult to unpick. Either way, she stayed. She stayed through the Merryweather contracts and the offshore fund management and the car theft scheme and the film insurance fraud and the instruction to take the print to the airport and run if anyone came after her. She ran. Whether she knew what that said about her is a question she is no longer available to answer. When Weston decided to bury the Meltdown film, he sent Molly to take the print. The plan was simple. She would collect the physical print copy of the completed film, hold it somewhere Weston controlled, and the production would be unable to formally complete. No completion, no premiere, the insurance clause activated. She took the print. She drove to Los Santos International Airport. Michael DeSanta came after her. He had found out through Solomon Richards, who told him what was happening to his studio and to the film he had put genuine effort into. Michael went to LSIA not to hurt Molly. He was going to talk to her. He was going to get the print back and explain that the plan was over. Whether or not he would have succeeded in that conversation is unknowable, because Molly never let the conversation happen. She saw him coming across the tarmac. She knew what it looked like when one of Weston's adversaries tracked you down at an airport with that expression on his face. She made a decision in a moment, the way people make decisions when fear is in charge, and she ran. She ran toward the planes, toward the airstrip, toward the engines and the noise and the movement. She was trying to put space between herself and Michael, and the space available at an active airport is the space between aircraft. She didn't see the engine until she was close to it. The turbine was running. Taxiing aircraft do not stop for what enters their intake. She was gone in under a second. Michael took the print back to Solomon Richards. The film survived. The premiere went ahead. Devin Weston put on a tuxedo and attended. He found Michael in the crowd of the Meltdown premiere, at the screening of the film he had tried to destroy, which was playing because his plan had failed, in the room where the success of his scheme's opposite was being publicly celebrated. He found Michael there, and he smiled. Not the smile of a grieving man doing his best. A smile. The warm, particular smile he used when he was most dangerous, when the next thing he was going to say was going to land worst. He told Michael, in the conversational tone of someone sharing an interesting piece of news, that Merryweather soldiers were currently en route to his home in Rockford Hills, his wife Amanda, his daughter Tracy. Then he slipped back into the crowd. On his Life Invader page, later, he wrote this: "Molly, you were one of the most committed and ruthless lawyers I've ever had on my books. I promise you that your death will not be in vain." Read that slowly. I promise you that your death will not be in vain. He is promising a dead woman that her death will be made useful. He is converting what might, in another person, have registered as loss, the loss of the one person in his world who had chosen to be there, into a budget line. Collateral for the campaign he was now running against Michael DeSanta's family. She had died, and he had already turned it into a reason for the next move. There is something that should be said about this tribute, or about what it fails to be. Molly Schultz worked for Devin Weston from 2009 to 2013, 4 years. She managed his legal affairs, his operational logistics, his relationships with law enforcement, his car theft enterprise, his film insurance scheme. She was brilliant at it. She was loyal in a way that nobody else in his world was loyal. She was, by every available evidence, the most capable person in his professional life. And when she died, when she ran across an airport tarmac in panic and was pulled into an engine because she was afraid, what he offered her was a promise that her death would not be wasted. He converted her into a budget item. He had treated every other person in his life as a function, a resource, an instrument calibrated to a purpose, and replaceable when the purpose was served or the instrument failed. The difference with Molly was that she had not been replaceable, and he had treated her exactly the same way anyway. He had not noticed the difference because the difference was in her, not in his relationship to her. She gave more than she was required to give. He took exactly what the role provided and nothing more. After Molly, there was no one in Devin Weston's life who was there because they wanted to be. Don Percival was waiting for a better arrangement. Steve Haynes needed a resource. The Merryweather soldiers were on contract. The lawyers who replaced Molly were on salary, and Franklin, Trevor, and Michael, the 3 men he had been calling slick and deploying like tools in a workshop, were, by the night of the Meltdown premiere, not even close to his side. He did not see it, or he saw it and calculated that it didn't matter because he still had the money and the army and the government connections, and those things had always been enough before. He was wrong. He was about to be wrong in a way that would take him somewhere he could not buy his way back from. The first time Michael DeSanta and Trevor Phillips met Devin Weston, they were at a torture session. This is worth sitting with as a first impression. The building was a Covington supplies facility in Los Santos. Inside, a man named Ferdinand Kerimov had been brought in by FIB agent Steve Haynes under suspicion of terrorism, and the question of what was going to happen to him was being worked out in real time. The atmosphere in the room was the specific chill of a space where everyone present has already decided to let something bad occur and is waiting for it to begin. Weston attended as an observer. He was there because Haynes had invited him. They had a working relationship, one of resources and leverage rather than affection, and Haynes wanted Weston aware that the FIB's off-books operations had teeth. Weston watched the proceedings with the detached attention of a man attending a meeting that touches on his interests without requiring his direct participation. He said the appropriate things. He left. He never did anything himself. The formal introduction to all three protagonists came later. Michael had become entangled in Haynes' operation through a combination of leverage and a reluctant desire to get back to the life he had retired from. Franklin had been drawn into the circle through Trevor, through the Merryweather vehicle heist, through the cascading series of commitments that tends to accumulate around men with Michael's skill set when they go back to work. Trevor was there because Trevor was always there after the Blitz play, an armoured truck robbery staged by Haynes to recover IAA bonds. Michael delivered the bonds to Weston's house, not a neutral meeting place, his house, an invitation to see where he lived, what he owned, how he occupied space. Weston received Michael the way a man receives a prospective employee, with studied warmth and a clear hierarchy already established. He arranged a formal meeting for the full group. The location was a construction site in Alta, in the high-rise corridor where the new towers of Los Santos were being built, floor by floor, over the bones of the neighborhoods that had been there before. Weston arrived in his black Adder. Molly was beside him in a grey Felon, precise and neat. He was wearing what he almost always wore in his professional life, something expensive and deliberately casual, the clothing of a man for whom getting dressed for work means reaching for what he would wear anyway. Franklin was there first. Weston looked him over, young, from South Los Santos, competent enough to have made himself useful in the operations that had preceded this meeting, and opened the conversation with this sentence: "I'm rich enough to do whatever the fuck I want, and you're poor enough not to ask me any goddamn stupid questions." This sentence is worth examining because it is the most precise self-portrait Weston ever offered. He didn't say it to wound Franklin or to humiliate him, though it accomplished both. He said it to establish a fact, the structure of the relationship they were entering, the respective positions, the rules that governed the interaction. In his mind, this was useful information. He was giving Franklin the framework. The rich person has latitude, the poor person has function. Understanding this distinction would allow them to work together productively. He said it as though it were the most reasonable thing in the world. He believed it was. Trevor arrived eventually, tried to flirt with Molly, got shut down without visible effort on her part, and summarized the situation for Michael when Michael appeared. Here was the situation. Weston wanted 5 cars, rare, specific, valuable cars, currently in the possession of people he called his contemporaries and his so-called friends. He wanted these cars stolen and delivered to a point in northern San Andreas, from which they would be transported to Chinese government officials who had expressed interest in acquiring them. He had a specific buyer. He had a specific price. He had the logistics of the exit worked out. What he needed was the extraction. People who could take the cars from their current owners without the kind of attention that would make the subsequent transaction complicated. "It's kinda like a little hobby of mine," he explained, requisitioning the underappreciated possessions of my contemporaries for some wealthy communists in China who will value them much more. He said this with genuine apparent pleasure. He was robbing his friends. He called them that directly, his so-called friends. And he had decided to tell the people doing the robbing exactly what it was, which was either a sign of respect or a sign that he felt comfortable enough in his position to not bother with the usual narrative management. He didn't need them to think well of him. He needed them to perform the function. To Michael, running alongside the car scheme, he offered access to Solomon Richards, the filmmaker, the man Michael had admired since before he was a criminal, since he was a boy from whatever city he grew up in who watched movies the way other children looked at windows and saw the world through them. Weston would make the introduction. Michael would get to be, for a while, a movie man. In exchange, Michael would continue cooperating with Haynes' operations and whatever else Weston needed from the broader arrangement. The trap was precisely designed. It required no obvious coercion. It offered things people actually wanted. It just did so in a context that would become, over time, increasingly difficult to exit. The first cars were a pair, the Entity XF and the Cheetah. They belonged to two young men named Henry Smythe IV and Sebastian, trust fund recipients in the specific Los Santos tradition of inherited wealth expressed as automotive enthusiasm. They raced on the Senora Freeway on weekends. They raced because they had money, and because money, in the absence of anything more demanding, tends to express itself through speed. Their cars were worth far more than either of them understood, which is also traditional. Weston's plan was elegant in the way that plans are elegant when they do not require you to be present for their execution. Franklin took a red F620, provided by Weston, and drove north to the Tatavium truck stop, where the two young men staged their races. He inserted himself into their circuit. He challenged them. They accepted immediately, as wealthy young men with fast cars tend to accept challenges from strangers, because the alternative of not accepting would mean acknowledging a concern that their confidence didn't allow for. They raced north, Franklin between them, the orange Entity XF and blue Cheetah flanking him on the Senora Freeway through the high desert, the three cars moving fast through the scrub and the dry heat. Meanwhile, north of them, Michael and Trevor were already positioned. They wore San Andreas Highway Patrol uniforms, borrowed, not issued. They sat on SAHP police bikes on the Cassidy Creek Bridge near Palito Bay and waited for Franklin's signal. When the convoy reached the bridge, the lights came on. Michael and Trevor moved in on the bikes, sirens running, and the trust fund kids did what people in expensive cars tend to do when a police officer pulls alongside them on a bridge. They pulled over. The stop was conducted with reasonable professional courtesy, given the context. The young men were separated from their vehicles. The vehicles were driven away. Within approximately 8 minutes of the stop, Henry Smythe IV was posting on his social media page, "The police threw Sebastian off a bridge and took our cars. The cars were dropped at Hayes Autos on Little Bighorn Avenue in South Los Santos. Weston told them there would be no payment until all 5 cars were delivered. Car 3 was the Z-Type, one of only 10 ever made. Not a reproduction, not a tribute to a design, an actual original, from the original production run, in the class of objects where the value is partly monetary and partly about what it means that something exists at all." Its current owner was Chad Mulligan, a music producer who had come into possession of the car through circumstances that gave him reason to be discreet about its location. He was in the middle of a divorce and managing his assets carefully, which meant that conventional surveillance, watching known addresses, tracking movement through financial records, could not pin down where the car was being kept. The solution was aerial. Trevor, in a helicopter, tracked Mulligan through the city until the man's movements led back to his lockup, a garage in Hawick, on a street without the kind of foot traffic that tends to generate witnesses. Franklin went in on the ground. He got the Z-Type out. He drove it to Weston's private hangar at LSIA, where Molly received it without comment and left. Car 4 was the JB 700, a different category of object entirely, old British design, the kind of car associated with a very specific era of English cultural self-presentation, the 1960s spy film aesthetic that had been commercially successful enough to become permanently embedded in the global imagination. This particular JB 700 had something the original design didn't come with: functional machine guns mounted behind the headlights and deployable through a switch on the dash, and a caltrop system in the rear that scattered metal spikes across the road behind the car when activated. The license plate read 4 Gent. The car was on a film lot at Backlot City in Vinewood, being used as a prop in whatever production was running through the studios that week. Franklin went in, found it, got behind the wheel, and discovered the weapons when the lot's security responded to an unauthorized vehicle on the property. The machine guns and the caltrops were fully functional. The film lot's security learned this first. Franklin delivered the car. Car 5 was the Monroe, a classic American design from the period when American car manufacturing was producing the cars that would spend the next 60 years defining what people meant when they said the word classic. Also on the Backlot City lot, also a film prop, also an object of significant value that its current custodians had not been keeping under heavy guard. Lamar Davis stole this one. Lamar had been following the operation at a careful distance since before the formal meeting at the Alta construction site. He was Franklin's oldest friend. They had grown up together in South Los Santos in the specific proximity of two people who come from the same place and stay connected through the momentum of shared origin even when their paths begin to diverge. Lamar had watched Franklin move into work with people he didn't fully know, doing things whose scope Lamar had only partially been told. He had decided, without anyone asking him, that he should be adjacent to this. He had tracked the operation the way he tracked most things, sideways through observation and the particular intelligence that comes from knowing someone well enough to read the gaps in what they say. He had worked out that there was a 5th car. He had worked out which lot it was on. He had gone and got it. He brought the Monroe to the staging area where Trevor was assembling the Packer without alerting anyone and without using any weapons, which was a point of quiet pride. Trevor, presented with an unauthorized delivery of the exact car they needed, was positive about it. The Packer is a car-hauling semi-truck, the industrial workhorse of San Andreas's automotive transport network. Trevor had sourced one, loaded the 5 cars onto its flatbed with the efficient attention of someone who has moved heavy equipment in difficult circumstances before and finds the activity satisfying. Lamar climbed into the cab. Franklin drove the Monroe up the ramp himself and secured it in the last position. Trevor pulled out of South Los Santos and headed north on the highway. The drive took several hours. The road climbs up the Pacific coast from the city, through Chumash, past the beaches and the cliff sections, through the long stretch where the ocean sits to the left and the mountains rise to the right, and the distance between things starts to feel like Northern California rather than a metropolitan area. Past Galilee, past the point where the land stops looking managed and starts looking merely occupied, into the region where the clusters of development thin to isolated buildings and the highway feels less like infrastructure and more like a decision. Lamar talked. He talked on long drives the way some people keep radios on, as ambient occupancy of silence rather than deliberate communication. He asked about Weston. He had not been at the Alta meeting, but he had heard the broad shape of the man from Franklin, and he wanted Trevor's read, because Trevor's read of people was reliable in the specific way that people with no social anxiety and no investment in being liked tend to be reliable. Trevor's read of Weston was delivered without diplomatic adjustment. Franklin napped in the middle portion of the drive. He woke up north of Galilee when the road changed quality, somewhere near Hookie's, with the Procopio truck stop visible as a cluster of lights ahead. The police responded. 2 LSSD units from the north closing fast. The wanted level came up. The Packer, at full load and highway speed, was not a vehicle with options for evasive driving. Franklin unhooked the JB 700. He drove it off the flatbed at speed. The ramp hit the asphalt with a spark that disappeared in the mirror, and he put the car between the Packer and the pursuing units. The machine guns behind the headlights found the first car. The Caltrops found the second. The pursuit degraded. Trevor held the Packer on the road at the same speed he had maintained since they left the city. The Procopio truck stop came up on the right. They pulled in. Molly was there, alone. In the dark of the lot, standing near her car, neat and composed, in the way she was always neat and composed in operational contexts, holding a piece of information she had been sent to deliver, waiting for the right moment to deliver it. She explained that Weston had been unable to attend in person, citing the police activity the delivery had attracted. She explained that the payment had been invested on their behalf. She gave a timeline that was expressed as a range rather than a date. She noted that the investment would be returned once the situation was less active. She said this without visible discomfort and without the specific tells that appear in people who are saying something they privately disagree with. Molly had made her peace with her role before she arrived. Franklin called Weston directly. The call was short. Weston confirmed the investment framework, cited his spiritual practice's emphasis on the acceptance of impermanent arrangements, said namaste, and ended the call. Franklin held his phone in the dark parking lot and looked at the 5 cars on the truck, and then at the space where Molly's car had been before she left. The space was empty. The ocean was nearby, audible under the quiet of the lot. He said nothing for a while. Trevor beside him made a sound that covered everything he thought of the situation in one syllable. It was not a syllable that required translation. Neither Franklin nor Trevor, nor Michael nor Lamar received a single dollar for the cars. 5 rare vehicles extracted from their owners. 2 staged highway patrol operations executed in stolen law enforcement gear, 1 aerial surveillance mission, 1 incursion into an active film lot, weapons engaged, 1 400-mile round trip in a loaded semi, 1 police pursuit neutralized using a spy car's mounted arsenal, and in exchange a namaste and an explanation about investments delivered by a man who had never, not once, put himself within 50 miles of any of the situations he had just described. Franklin drove south alone. He drove slowly, which was unusual for him, and he thought about what the next move was. Trevor drove south faster, with a specific energy that tends to characterize people who have made a decision they haven't yet announced. Michael, who found out later through a phone call from Franklin, received the news with the controlled internal response of someone who had known this was possible, had not quite believed it would happen, and now had to decide what to do with the knowledge that it had. Weston moved on. He was already thinking about the film. He did not look back at the 3 men he had just defrauded. He should have. While the car scheme was running, while Franklin was racing trust fund kids on the Senora freeway, and Trevor was tracking a record producer from a helicopter, and the Packer was loaded and driven north through the coastal dark, Devin Weston had been working a parallel operation entirely. The car scheme was visible to the 3 men he had hired for it. The film scheme was not visible to anyone he hadn't chosen to inform. That was its value. He had purchased into Richard's Majestic with a specific sequence of events in mind. Solomon Richards was one of Vinewood's survivors, a producer from the era when Vinewood made the kind of films that people talked about for decades afterward, a man who had watched the industry move in directions he mostly did not respect, and had kept making the kind of movies he believed in anyway. He was old and stubborn and talented, and entirely genuine in his feeling that film mattered. He had, in the course of his career, experienced most of what the industry could do to a person, the studio politics, the talent management, the creative compromises demanded by budgets and markets, and the opinions of people who confused commercial instinct with artistic judgment, and had arrived at a version of himself that was mostly undamaged, which was genuinely rare. He was not naive. He had been in the business long enough to understand what a man like Weston looked like when he bought into a creative enterprise. He knew what investors who were not interested in the product they were funding looked like, the specific quality of their interest, the way they talked about the studio in terms that were always financial and never creative, the absence from their conversation of any reference to whether what was being made was good or not, as though the product were a container ship rather than a thing that would be watched by human beings in a dark room and would either matter to them or not. He knew all of this. He had taken the investment anyway because the studio needed capital, and the capital was there, and sometimes you make that deal. He did not know, when he made it, what the specific mechanism was going to be. The insurance mechanics are specific. A film studio carries a completion bond and a production insurance policy. The completion bond is a financial guarantee issued by a specialized insurance company. It promises distributors and financiers that the film will be delivered on schedule and on budget, and if it is not, the bond company steps in to manage or complete the production. The production insurance covers losses when the delivery genuinely cannot be made, when the production collapses, when the film cannot be finished, when something catastrophic happens to the project itself. These instruments together create a financial safety net around productions designed to protect the people who have committed money to seeing something made. They also create, for the right kind of investor, a specific opportunity. A studio reaches its peak investable value, the moment when the gap between investment value and insurance payout is widest, when a significant production is complete but not yet formally delivered. The film exists. The work is done, the talent has been paid, the locations have been shot, the editing has been completed, the score has been laid in, the color has been graded, the product exists in its finished form, but it has not yet been formally transferred into the distribution chain, which is where the commercial machinery takes over and the value of the studio's involvement begins to decline. This is the window. The narrow period where the insurance instrument is worth more than the ongoing relationship. Buy in at the peak. Manufacture the inability to complete the delivery. The bond activates. The insurance pays out. You collect and move on. Weston had constructed this plan around Meltdown, a film that Michael DeSanta had worked on with something that surprised him every time he noticed it in himself. He had been on that set. He had dealt with the problems that sets generate, the talent who needed managing, the production decisions that needed making, the logistical complications that multiplied whenever you put a lot of people in a location with expensive equipment and asked them to coordinate. He had found that he was good at it, which was not entirely surprising given his history of coordinating people in complicated operational situations. What surprised him was that he cared. He had not intended to care. The caring arrived anyway, in the gradual way things arrive when you spend enough time with them. Weston assigned Molly the task of taking the print. The physical print copy of a completed film is, in a pre-streaming distribution world, the artifact from which all copies flow. No print, no screening copies, no distribution, no premiere, no proof of completion. The plan was simple. Molly would collect the print before it could be formally delivered to Richard's Majestic's distribution chain. She would hold it somewhere Weston controlled. The premiere would be unable to proceed. The completion bond clause would activate. The insurance payout would follow. Molly collected the print. She left the studio. She drove toward LSIA. Solomon Richards, watching his film disappear into the logistics of what he suspected was not a legitimate transfer, called Michael. Michael went to the airport. He found Molly on the tarmac at LSIA. She had a head start, but not a large one. He was moving toward her across the tarmac with the specific energy of a man who wants to talk and has information she needs to hear. He was not going to hurt her. He wanted to explain that the situation had changed, that Weston's plan was known, that she could stop. He was probably going to have to convince her of this, because Molly's operational loyalty did not yield easily to outside persuasion, but he was going to try. She didn't let him try. She saw him coming, and she made a decision in the second that panic allows for decisions. She ran, away from Michael, toward the airstrip, toward the planes that were moving through their pre-flight and taxi routines with the indifference to human drama that large machines maintain. She was trying to create space between herself and the man coming after her, and the only space available at an active airport tarmac was the space between aircraft. She got too close to a taxiing plane. The engine was running. Turbines intake at a rate that does not distinguish between air and what enters with the air. She was close enough that the intake got her. She was gone in less than a second. Michael stood on the tarmac with the print that had come loose in the chaos and looked at where she had been. He picked it up. He brought it back to Solomon Richards. The premieres went ahead. As scheduled, Meltdown was released. Solomon Richards kept his studio, and Devin Weston put on a tuxedo and went to the premiere. He walked into the Tivoli Cinema in Vinewood with the ease of a man attending an event he had organized rather than one that represented the failure of his plans. He was good at this, the performance of equanimity in contexts where equanimity was the specific skill required. He moved through the crowd with the practiced naturalism of someone who has learned that if you act like you belong, most people will accept that you do. He found Michael. They stood near each other in the crowd of the premiere of the film that was playing because Weston's scheme had failed, and Weston smiled, not the smile of grief, not the performance of composure over loss. A genuine smile, the specific kind he produced when he was about to deliver something devastating and had decided to frame it as a piece of interesting news. He told Michael quietly, warmly, conversationally that he had already dispatched Merryweather soldiers to the house in Rockford Hills, Amanda, Tracy. He mentioned Molly, acknowledged that she was gone, offered the tribute that appeared on his Life Invader page, one of the most committed and ruthless lawyers he had ever employed. Her death will not be in vain. He said it as a thing you say. He had already moved past it, past her, into the operational requirements of what came next. She was dead. That was a waste, and the response to waste was to convert it into purpose. He finished his glass of something. He moved back into the crowd. Michael and Jimmy drove home. The house in Rockford Hills was already under assault when they arrived. Merryweather had not wasted time. A professional unit, in tactical kit, moving through the property with the organized efficiency of trained men. They were inside the perimeter. They were near the doors. Amanda was inside. Tracy was inside. Michael and Jimmy cleared the property. It was not a clean process, and it was not a brief one, but when it ended, the Merryweather unit was neutralized, and Amanda and Tracy DeSanta were alive. Michael stood in the house he had bought with money from a career he had tried to leave, and looked at his family that was alive because of a margin that could have been different, and felt the specific cold clarity that tends to arrive in the aftermath of narrow things. Weston had failed, and this is the exact moment when the story of Devin Weston stops being the story of a businessman with brutal methods and becomes the story of something smaller and more dangerous. Up to this point, his moves were ruthless, but they followed logic. The car scheme was extraction through leverage, theft at arm's length, payment withheld because the power differential made withholding costless. The film scheme was financial manipulation, an insurance play, legal in its goals if criminal in its means, designed to convert a studio's peak value into a payout before the value declined. Even Molly's death, however it registered to him personally, was an operational casualty, a loss of a human asset, which he expressed in exactly those terms. The attack on Michael's family was different. It was not a financially rational decision. The film had survived, but one failed insurance scheme did not damage Weston's overall financial position. The studio survived, but Richard's Majestic was one holding among dozens, and its continued existence did not threaten his operations. Molly was gone, but Molly was replaceable from a purely functional standpoint, and Weston was too experienced in the mechanics of business to confuse grief with financial damage. There was no reason to send soldiers to Rockford Hills, no ledger in which that action improved his position. What there was, an ego that had been defied. Michael DeSanta had seen through his scheme, warned Solomon Richards, chased Molly across the tarmac, retrieved the print, ensured the film survived, and was now at the premiere watching Weston's plan fail in real time. Michael had made Weston look like someone whose plans could be countered. Nobody was supposed to counter Devin Weston's plans. The plans were supposed to happen, and then the outcomes were supposed to follow, and the people involved were supposed to discover, when the dust settled, that they had been inside a thing they didn't understand until it was over. Michael had understood it in progress and stopped it. For a man who had not heard the word no in any meaningful professional context in 20 years, who had built an entire structural apparatus specifically designed to render no unavailable as a response, this was not a strategic setback, it was an insult. He sent the soldiers because the insult demanded a response. And when the response failed, when Michael and Jimmy cleared the house and his family survived, he did not stop. He did not look at the failed assault on a civilian residence, the operational exposure it had created, the additional enemies it had made, and decide to cut his losses and move on. He went jogging. He picked a morning, put on the compression shorts and technical shirt, and ran to Franklin Clinton's house. He went at a pace that implied a regular route with a stop at the end of it. He arrived without visible haste, without visible stress, without the sweat of a man who has just sent a mercenary team to kill a woman and a teenage girl and watched it fail and is now improvising the next move. He arrived with the ease of someone fitting a conversation into a workout. This is worth dwelling on. The man who had sent soldiers to a residential address in Rockford Hills, soldiers from a company in which he held an 11% stake, was now jogging to another residential address to present the person who lived there with a menu of lethal options. He was doing this in the same clothes he wore to run 20 miles before breakfast. He had apparently decided that these two activities, morning run and directing an assassination, belonged in the same register, occupied the same emotional space. This is what had happened inside Devin Weston by the time the Meltdown premiere ended. The math that had governed his decisions for 30 years had not stopped running. It was still there, still accessible, still deployable in conversation. He could still construct a logical case, but beneath the math, something older and simpler had taken over, the mechanism that had always gotten what it wanted and could not process the experience of not getting it. He was no longer doing the math. He was running on the ego animal, the part that demands a response when defied and cannot be satisfied by cutting losses and moving on. He knocked on Franklin's door. He had not yet understood that the three men he had been treating as chess pieces were about to pick the board up and throw it. Franklin Clinton was at home when Devin Weston arrived. He came jogging, in compression shorts and a technical shirt, moving at an easy pace through the street outside Franklin's house as though the city were a treadmill and the errand he was running, the delivery of a set of options that included the murder of Franklin's mentor, was something that fit naturally into the cardio portion of his morning. He arrived without appearing to have hurried. He was barely sweating. He went inside. He sat down. He began to explain what he wanted. Michael DeSanta, he said, had become a liability. He did not say liability in a tone that suggested he found the word inadequate. He meant it precisely. Michael was a cost that exceeded his value, an investment that had gone underwater, a position that needed to be closed. He had gotten all three of them, Franklin, Weston, and the broader operation, entangled with the federal government in ways that created ongoing exposure. He had disrupted the film scheme. He had been present for, and in some sense responsible for, the circumstances in which Molly Schultz had died. From an operational standpoint, the intelligent resolution was removal. He wanted Franklin to kill him. Franklin said he hadn't been paid. Weston acknowledged this the way he acknowledged everything that was inconvenient but insufficiently serious to require a real response, with a brief nod that suggested the point was noted without confirming that it would be addressed. He explained that he had the capacity to protect Franklin from the FIB pressure, from Haynes and Norton, who had their own assignment they wanted Franklin to carry out, which was to kill Trevor Phillips. Weston had the relationships to make that pressure stop. This was what he was offering in exchange, not money, the removal of a threat. Then he laid out the structure. Option A, do what the FIB wanted, kill Trevor. The FIB would be satisfied. Haynes would back off. The federal entanglement would decrease. Option B, do what Weston wanted, kill Michael. Weston would neutralize the FIB situation. Franklin would have Weston's protection, which was considerable. He left option C hanging in the room like a weight. He implied rather than stated that refusing both options, trying to navigate the situation without satisfying either demand, would leave Franklin exposed from every direction simultaneously, the FIB on one side, Weston's Merryweather resources on the other, whatever else might be assembled against him by two powerful institutional interests that he'd managed to refuse in the same conversation. He didn't threaten explicitly. Explicit threats are for people who don't have the architecture to make implicit ones understood. He stood up. He stretched lightly. He said he'd be in touch. He jogged out. The structure he had left behind in Franklin's living room was beautifully constructed in its way, a set of options designed to look like a choice when they were actually a trap. Choose A. You lose Trevor and the protection he represents and the relationship with Michael that has been the most functional professional relationship of Franklin's adult life. Choose B. You kill Michael and carry that weight alone and remain inside the Weston Haynes system with Weston holding the protection and Franklin holding nothing but the knowledge of what he did. Refuse both. You are exposed to multiple institutional threats with no allies and no cover. Weston had built these traps for 30 years. He was good at them. They worked because they were based on an accurate read of the power differential. He had more resources, more reach, more options than the people he presented them to, and the traps functioned precisely because of that gap. The assumption he couldn't help making was that everyone inside his traps shared his framework, that they understood the game in the same terms he did and were calculating their response within its rules. Franklin Clinton did not accept the rules of games he hadn't agreed to play. He sat in his house after Weston left, and he thought about it. Not about which option to choose. He thought about what it meant that a man had come to his house, jogging, and presented a set of options that all pointed toward the same outcome for the people Franklin actually cared about. He thought about what it said that the options were structured that way. He thought about whether a person who had built a situation this completely had actually built it completely. He picked up his phone. He called Lester Crest. Lester Crest was a man Franklin had come to understand through working with him, his specific texture of intelligence, his ability to see systems from the outside, his preference for solving problems the way you solve a mathematical equation rather than the way you solve them with muscle. He planned things. He saw angles. He understood the space between what people presented and what was actually happening. He had, in the basement of his house in Murrieta Heights, a workspace that looked like the inside of a very specific kind of mind, organized, cross-referenced, full of information about how Los Santos and the people in it actually worked versus how they claimed to work. When Franklin explained the situation, Weston, Haynes, the ABC structure, what each option required, Lester was quiet for a moment. Then he said something unexpected. He said it might genuinely be easier to just kill Michael. Lester Crest, the man who had mapped out the assassinations of half a dozen corrupt corporate executives with the calm of someone solving a scheduling problem, who had planned the Palito Bay bank job and the foundational logistics of the Union Depository heist, who handled the coordination of three volatile and mutually suspicious personalities without losing his composure or his precision, who calculated human lives in systems the same way other people calculate revenue. He looked at what Devin Weston had built and told Franklin it might be beyond them, that it might be easier to comply. Let that settle. Lester Crest, whose entire professional orientation was toward finding solutions that other people believed were impossible, looked at the ABC structure Weston had presented and told Franklin that the most intelligent option was probably to choose one of Weston's options. The smartest man in any room in Los Santos looked at Weston's architecture and said, "Maybe you just do what he's asking. This matters not because Lester was right, he wasn't, but because of what his hesitation reveals about Weston. Weston had built something that could make Lester Crest, even briefly, consider compliance as the rational path, the Merryweather stake, the FIB connections, the money that reached everywhere, the ability to offer protection from one threat in exchange for compliance with another. He had constructed the trap with enough layers that the most analytical mind in the game paused at the edge of it and said, maybe the trap is the right place to be. Franklin told him he was not killing Michael. He said this without heat and without explanation. He said it the way you say a thing that is true and does not require additional support, a fact about what he was going to do, delivered without asking whether Lester agreed with it. Then he told Lester he needed something outside the structure Weston had built, a fourth option, something that didn't require accepting any of the terms of the trap. Lester went quiet again. This was a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of uncertainty, which had been the first silence, but the quiet of someone who has set the first answer aside and begun looking for the real one. There is a specific quality to how Lester Crest thinks when he is thinking at full capacity. He gets very still. The processing becomes invisible from the outside. When he speaks again, he has moved somewhere. He told Franklin what he was considering. 4 targets, simultaneous. Haynes, Cheng, Stretch, and Weston, all of them hit in the same narrow window before any one of them could receive warning about what was happening to the others. The logic was clean. Any sequential approach gave the remaining targets time to adapt. Simultaneous removed that time. The window where simultaneous was possible was specific and short. If they were going to do it, they had to commit to doing it exactly this way. He explained the operational complexity honestly. 3 simultaneous operations required coordination so tight that a single delay in any thread exposed the others. It required Michael, Trevor, and Franklin, 3 men who had spent months being positioned against each other, to function as a single unit for approximately an hour. He called it the Deathwish option, not because the name was dramatic, but because it described what it was. All 3 of them, together, against everything that wanted them dead, at the same time, with the resources available rather than the ones they would have preferred. Franklin sat with it. Then he said, "Set it up." He called Michael. Michael was at home, in the pool, by the available evidence, in his underwear, which is the image the game provides, and which is worth sitting with for a moment. The most dangerous day of his post-retirement life, and Michael DeSanta was floating in his Rockford Hills pool in his underwear. He either trusted Franklin's read of the situation completely, or he had arrived at a version of himself that found the prospect of resolution, in whatever form it took, preferable to the ongoing accumulation of threats from every direction. He said yes. Franklin called Trevor. Trevor said yes immediately, and with specific enthusiasm about the part that involved going to Weston's house. This enthusiasm needed no further investigation. The plan was set. Weston had given Franklin 3 options. Franklin had found a 4th. The three men, who had been treated as chess pieces in a game they hadn't designed, were about to play a different game entirely, one with rules Weston hadn't written and a board he hadn't built. He was at his mansion when it happened, near the pool. It ran on 3 tracks. The first track was Franklin Clinton in the south of the city. His assignment was Wei Cheng, the leader of the Triads operation out of Strawberry, who had been hunting Trevor across San Andreas under the mistaken impression that Trevor was a loose end that needed to be managed. Chung had made the same mistake that most people made about Trevor, which was to assume that the unpredictability was a weakness. Franklin found him and corrected that impression. The second track was Michael DeSanta and the Maze Bank Arena. Steve Haynes was there, at a public event, under camera coverage, managing his own narrative in real time with the specific confidence of a man who believed his institutional position made him untouchable in the open. Michael disagreed. He went to the arena. He found Haynes on the roof, which is where public events and institutional positions stop providing cover. Haynes discovered this. The third track was Trevor Phillips and Tongva Hills. He knew where the house was. Lester had confirmed the address, though it was not exactly secret. The property on Buen Vino Road appeared in the background of conversations at events Weston attended, in the kind of architectural feature writing that covers expensive hillside properties, in the peripheral references that accumulate around anyone who lives visibly and expensively in a city like Los Santos. Large house, pool, Tongva Hills view. The kind of property whose existence is communicated not by the owner bragging about it, but by the details everyone else mentions in its presence. 8 Merryweather soldiers on rotation. Trevor went at night. He drove up from the city without haste, which was an unusual mode for Trevor, but the thing about the night portion of this operation was that haste would have been counterproductive, noise would have been counterproductive. The value of arriving at the Tongva Hills property before Weston could receive any warning from the other 2 targets being hit simultaneously was the value of information control, and information control required moving without the specific signature that Trevor's preferred approach tended to leave behind him. He parked on the road below the property and went the rest of the way on foot. He approached from a line of sight that the security deployment hadn't fully accounted for, a gap between 2 positions that the placement of the 8 men had left because the coverage model they were running had been designed for a more obvious threat profile. This is a common limitation in security deployments that are designed to look comprehensive rather than be comprehensive. The positions covered the gates, the main approach, the driveway, the rear perimeter. They did not cover the assumption that someone would come in over the terrain between the planned approach vectors rather than through them. Trevor was capable of careful. His reputation makes this easy to forget, but the reputation is built on the results of his actions rather than on observation of his methods. He could move quietly when moving quietly served the purpose, and tonight moving quietly served the purpose precisely. He moved through the property with the focused attention of someone who has done this kind of work before, not the specific work of this exact operation, but the category of work that this belonged to, which is reaching a person who has professional protection without the professional protection knowing you are there until it is too late for that knowledge to be useful. He moved through the Merryweather team. He moved through the gate. He moved through the grounds. The grounds of the Buen Vino Road property were the grounds of a man whose relationship to outdoor space was aesthetic rather than functional. The landscaping had been installed by professionals and maintained by professionals on a schedule that had nothing to do with any personal relationship Weston had with the plants. The outdoor furniture, the chairs, the table, the loungers near the pool, was expensive in the specific way that outdoor furniture is expensive when it has been selected by someone whose job is to select furniture for spaces like this, rather than by someone who intended to sit in it on a Tuesday afternoon reading. The pool was illuminated from underneath. blue-white light catching the surface of the water from below. The light had been left on. Nobody was in the pool. Nobody had been in the pool tonight. He went inside. The interior was the specific interior of a house that Devin Weston owned rather than lived in. The art was positioned for maximum visual impact in the sightlines from the primary interior spaces, chosen to impress, not to reflect. The surfaces were clean in the way that surfaces are clean when they are cleaned by people paid to keep them that way rather than by the people who occupy the space. The furniture was beautiful and slightly empty, like rooms in a hotel photographed for a website before any guests arrive. The kitchen was equipped in a way that suggested the equipment had been purchased rather than used. The refrigerator held the kind of things a raw food diet requires and a small selection of beverages that expressed a specific premium positioning. There was a yoga mat rolled out in one room, which was the only object in the house that looked like it had been touched recently. He went through the house room by room. He was looking for Weston. He found the Merryweather radio on a table near the rear exit, which told him the security team communicated through a channel he now had partial information about. He found a set of keys to a vehicle he didn't need. He found a drawer full of phones, backup devices, the kind a man keeps when he has enough money to want options. He left them. He found Weston near the pool, not at the gate, not in a defensible interior room, not behind the door with a phone to his ear calling for backup from the Merryweather soldiers who were, by this point, no longer in a position to provide backup, not demonstrating any of the decisive action that 30 years of aggressive financial maneuvering might have suggested he was capable of when the situation called for it. Near the pool, low, the posture of a man trying to occupy as little space as possible in a place where the decisions that had brought him here had stopped protecting him. The man who announced himself as the architect of the 2007 global financial crisis. The man who ran 20 miles before breakfast. The man who had deployed a Merryweather tactical team against a civilian residence in Rockford Hills with the casual authority of someone adjusting a calendar appointment. The man who had jogged, in compression shorts, to a young man's house to deliver a structured murder menu and then jogged back, crouching by his own pool, in his own house, hoping Trevor Phillips wouldn't see him. Trevor knocked him out with a single punch. He did not linger on this. He carried Weston across the patio and through the house and out to the driveway. The black Tornado was where it was always left, nearest the front door, the car you reach for when you are leaving quickly or without planning. He opened the trunk. He put Weston in it. He closed it. The license plate read "Moneyed." He got behind the wheel. He started the engine. Los Santos rock radio came on. Weston's preset, Weston's favorite. He left it on. He pulled out of the driveway. He called Franklin and Michael. "Chiliad Mountain State Wilderness. There's a cliff. Come when you're done. We're going to make him disappear." He drove. Weston woke up somewhere on the road north of the city. He came back to consciousness the way people do when they have been knocked unconscious by a single decisive blow, not gradually, not with dreamlike uncertainty, but with a specific physical jolt, the brain coming back online and immediately trying to assess the situation. He assessed it. Dark, enclosed, moving. His hands were behind him. His mouth was partially covered. He was in the trunk of a car, his own car. He could tell from the smell and the interior dimensions and the specific vibration signature of the engine, which he had heard from the driver's seat often enough to recognize from the trunk. The radio was playing Los Santos rock radio, his station. He tried to work out his options. This was the trained reflex of 30 years, the first response to any problem being a rapid survey of the available moves. What did he have? He had his voice. He had his mind. He had the residual authority of his position, which was still real even if its applicability to the current situation was limited. He had money, access to money at minimum, which in his framework was the most versatile resource anyone could bring to a problem. He started with the thing that had worked in every professional context he had ever occupied. "You know," he said, toward the front of the car, "you're a resourceful guy, getting past those trained killers. I need someone like you in my organization." Trevor answered from the front seat. "The CEO position's going to be vacant real soon, Slick?" Weston absorbed this. He tried a different frame, the frame of disambiguation. He had no personal issue with Trevor. Michael was the specific problem, the one who had disrupted the film scheme and made everything complicated. Trevor was collateral, which was unfortunate, but collateral damage was a solvable problem when the parties involved were willing to treat it as such. He was willing to treat it as such. He was proposing they solve it together. He had the resources to make the solution attractive. Trevor told him he was approaching it rationally. He said his own approach was not rational. He felt like killing Weston. The feeling was, in his assessment, sufficient reason. He didn't require the numbers to work out. He required the feeling to be present, which it was. Weston offered money. He named a figure. He named it clearly and without hesitation. The way you name a figure you have already determined is acceptable from a loss management standpoint. Trevor told him he was, at that moment, gold rich. This was true. The Union Depository heist had produced results. Trevor had resources that the figure Weston named did not substantially improve upon, and he had the specific resentment of a man who had been told he would be paid for 5 luxury cars and then been wished a namaste and hung up on. Weston's money, in this precise context, was not the resource he thought it was. Weston tried logic. He explained that the institutional structure behind him was too large to survive assaulting. Merryweather, the FIB connections, the financial reach. He explained that the rational calculation, when you ran it properly, came out in favor of a different decision. Trevor said something about the CEO position again. Weston tried the language of deals. He had operated in this language for 30 years. In boardrooms and restaurants and construction sites and federal facilities where torture was occurring in the adjacent room. The vocabulary of mutual benefit, of arrangements that served all parties, of terms that could be structured. He believed this language was universal, that it applied everywhere because it described a fundamental human interest in advantageous exchange. He deployed it with the same confidence he would have brought to any conversation it had ever worked in. The trunk remained closed. "Work for me," he said. "You'll have everything you've ever wanted." Trevor considered this genuinely. There was a pause that contained real consideration. "All I've ever wanted," Trevor said, "is to watch you drift in and out of consciousness as you're slowly disemboweled." Another pause. "Yes," Weston said. "That's the kind of creativity I need on my team." He was still recruiting. In the trunk of his own car, on a highway heading north toward a cliff, with his hands tied and his face bleeding and his own radio playing from the front seat without interest in his situation. He had cycled through money, position, logic, flattery, the language of deals, and the language of mutual benefit, and when none of those produced a result, he had arrived at expressing hiring enthusiasm for the psychotic fantasy of his captor. He was still trying to turn it into a transaction. The car slowed. The road had been climbing for a while. Weston could feel it in the angle, the way gravity pressed him toward the back wall of the trunk. They were high now. The air coming through the body of the car was cooler and carried the specific clean coldness of altitude and ocean proximity at the same time. They were somewhere above the city, in the wilderness north of Chumash, where the roads get specific and the land gets empty. The car stopped. The engine idled. Through the thin metal of the trunk, he heard another car arriving, then another. He knew who was coming. He tried a few more things in the silence while he waited. He made offers. He named numbers. He explained the rational case for keeping him alive. He had always had a rational case. He had always been able to construct one. The case was sound in the logical sense. He had money. He had resources. He had reach. He had the structural elements that made him worth dealing with rather than eliminating. Nobody opened the trunk. Michael arrived first. He pulled his car off the road onto the shoulder at the edge of the Chiliad mountain state wilderness, a dirt strip at the end of a narrowing road, the kind of place the map acknowledges without providing much encouragement to visit. He got out. He walked to the edge of the cliff and stood there and looked at the ocean. The Pacific at night, from a cliff in the wilderness north of the city, is a specific experience. There is no sound from below, because the cliff is too high and the water too far down for individual waves to resolve into anything identifiable. What reaches you is a collective low sound, the accumulated motion of a body of water that does not have opinions about who is standing at the edge looking at it. The water is dark. The horizon, where the water ends and the sky begins, is a line rather than a view, a clean edge with nothing interesting on either side of it, extending left and right until your eyes give up. The stars are present in a way they are not in the city. That is the only thing the cliff offers that the city does not. Michael stood at the edge for a while. He had been thinking about what to say. This is not always something Michael DeSanta did. He was capable of improvisation, had in fact built most of his career on it, and his best lines in conversation tended to be the ones he hadn't planned. But he had been thinking about this one. He had decided there was something he wanted Weston to hear before the end, and he had been turning it over since Franklin had told him the third way was happening, not as a speech, not as a prepared statement, as a thing that was true, that he wanted to say out loud to the man it was most true about. He took a cigarette out of his jacket. He put it between his lips. He stood there with it unlit, looking at the water and the dark and the line where they met, thinking about the sequence of decisions that had moved him from a pool in Rockford Hills to the edge of a cliff in the Chiliad mountain state wilderness. He took the cigarette out. He looked at it briefly. He threw it off the edge. He watched it fall until he couldn't. He waited. Franklin arrived. He pulled up behind Michael's car and got out and walked to where Michael was standing and stood beside him without speaking. They both looked at the ocean. This kind of silence, the kind between two people who have done something significant together and are standing in the immediate aftermath of it, does not require filling. It is not uncomfortable. It is the specific silence of a thing that hasn't been processed yet, but doesn't need to be processed aloud. Trevor arrived. He pulled the tornado off the road and stopped and got out and looked at the two of them at the cliff edge. He looked at the ocean. He looked back at the car. Then he walked to the trunk and opened it. Devin Weston was inside in the state that the previous hour had produced. The punch that had put him in the car had been the beginning of a chain of minor contacts between his body and the hard internal surfaces of the trunk during the drive north, and the cumulative result was visible in his face and in the way he was lying. He was badly bleeding. His shirt had come further apart. His hands were still behind him. The gag had shifted slightly, which meant he had been trying to work it loose during the drive, and had not succeeded. He had clearly been moving, and the trunk had not accommodated the attempts. He looked up at the three men standing at the open trunk. In the light from outside, the cold clarity of altitude and stars, he looked like what he was, a 51-year-old man who had spent his life building systems to insulate himself from this precise moment and had discovered in the final hour that the systems had a gap in them. Franklin looked at him for a moment. "My bad, homie," he said. "I picked C. Ain't that a bitch?" The expression on Weston's face went through several transitions in a brief space. Recognition? Assessment? The beginning of another calculation. He was still calculating even now, still looking for the move. And then, underneath all of that, the thing that his entire career had been constructed to prevent, genuine fear, not the fear of financial loss or reputational damage or regulatory attention, the fear that exists at the physical level, that arrives in the body before the mind has finished processing. He was afraid. Michael crouched down. He brought himself to Weston's level. He looked at him directly, the way you look at someone you have decided to be honest with because the circumstances no longer reward any other register. "You know, Devin," he said, "the way I see it, and hey, I'm no intelligent businessman like you, but the way I see it, there's two great evils that bedevil American capitalism of the type that you practice." He paused there to let the setup land. "Number one is outsourcing." He moved his right hand, a brief gesture indicating himself, then Franklin beside him, then Trevor, the three men standing in the Chiliad mountain state wilderness at 10 o'clock at night, who had been hired to do work that Weston did not want to do with his own hands, and who had done it, every piece of it, with competence and at cost. You paid a private company to do your dirty work for you, and then you underpaid that company because you thought you were big enough and bad enough that you didn't have to play by the rules. There is something in this sentence worth sitting with. Weston had, in a technical sense, paid them nothing, which made the underpaid phrasing almost generous. But Michael's point was not about the specific transaction, it was about the structure. The billionaire who uses other people's physical risk and labor to execute operations he needs deniability from, and who then exercises the power differential to avoid the financial obligation. The dynamic is older than Weston. It is the fundamental structure he had been running on since 1985, applied to people rather than companies. "Oh, and number two?" He glanced at Trevor. "Offshoring your profits?" Trevor offered. "Offshoring your profits?" Michael looked back at Weston. "You wouldn't want to be sent offshore just to save a little money, would you?" Weston, from the trunk, was still trying. His eyes were moving, not with panic, but with the specific focused movement of someone running through options. He was still there, still calculating, still looking for the exit that Michael's framing might have missed. He had been looking for exits since the trunk closed, and he had not stopped looking. This was what 30 years of business survival looked like from the inside. It didn't stop when the situation became obviously unsurvivable. It kept running. Michael looked at him for another moment. "But we know your opinions on that matter," he said quietly. "Keep your problems the fuck out of America, huh?" He stood up. He looked at Weston one final time from standing height. The look contained nothing performed. No triumph, no cold satisfaction, no heat. The look of a man who has ended a thing he did not start and who carries the ending without particular pride. "Hey, Devin," he said. "Goodbye, my old friend. Thanks for all the advice." The three of them put their hands on the car. It required more effort than a cliff scene in a movie would suggest. A car has mass, and the edge of a cliff is not optimally positioned for the direction of force you need to apply, and there is a genuine moment where the front wheels go over and the car sits balanced between the remaining rear grip and the gravity that is already claiming it. That moment, the brief balance, exists. Then the center of gravity crossed the line, and gravity resolved the question. The car went over. It did not fall clean. It tumbled in the way that large, heavy, asymmetric objects tumble when they leave a surface, and there is nothing below them to land on for a long distance. The hood catching the rock face, the car spinning clockwise, the roof taking the next contact and spinning it back, the windows going somewhere in the middle of the descent, and the sound arriving at the top of the cliff a split second after the visual evidence. It was a long fall. The cliff at this section of the Chiliad mountain state wilderness is not a gentle slope. It is the direct kind. It hit the shallow seabed at the base. The explosion spread from the point of impact outward, orange and white, expanding and then contracting, briefly illuminating the water surface in a circle wider than the car itself. The burning that followed was slower, the combustion of things that didn't explode but caught. The Pacific was not impressed. Within a few minutes, the fire above the waterline was gone. The car was on the seabed. The plate read, "Monid," The radio had stopped. The three of them stood at the cliff edge. None of them said anything for a while. The ocean went on being the ocean. The stars went on being the stars. The cold air came off the water with the same indifference it had before the car went over. The cliff did not mark the occasion. Then Franklin said, "Now what?" Michael looked at the water for another moment. He appeared to be thinking about how to answer this. Not because he didn't know the answer, he knew the answer, but because he was deciding whether the answer was right, whether the next part of his life was actually what he thought it was. "Now we keep a low profile," he said, "and get on with our lives." Trevor said, "As friends." A pause. It was a genuine pause, not the dramatic kind, not the kind where someone is waiting for the right moment to speak, the kind where three people are sitting with a word that has just been said and are trying to work out how they actually feel about it in the precise context of this night, this cliff, this thing they just did together. "No," Michael said, honest rather than unkind. "Not really." A beat. "All right," he said. "As flawed, awful, totally uncomfortable, poorly matched friends, absolutely." Trevor pointed out that they could now return to their own entrepreneurial activities, heists, better funded, better organized, the kind of work the union depository job had demonstrated they were capable of when they weren't being managed by someone else's agenda. He said this with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting to get back to a thing they are good at. Franklin looked at the water. "I don't know," he said. "I'm honestly not sure that's all that different from what Devin was doing." He said it without aggression. It was a real question. The real question, the one that Michael's cliff speech had opened but not closed. Michael had identified two great evils of the type of capitalism Weston practiced, but the three of them had also spent the year practicing something, a version of economic life that involved taking things that weren't theirs from people who hadn't offered them, using skills and violence in the same space, and keeping the results. The distinction between their version and Weston's was, what exactly? Scale? Pretension? The presence or absence of a yoga mat? Franklin was working this out. Michael looked at him. "Hypocrisy, Franklin," he said. "Civilization's greatest virtue." They walked back to their cars. The cliff stayed where it was. The ocean did what oceans do. They drove back south toward the city, separately, along the road that runs down the Pacific coast through Chumash and into the lights that never fully go out over Los Santos. Behind them, the Chiliad mountain state wilderness held its silence the way it always had, without preference, without memory, without any particular interest in what had occurred at the edge of it tonight. Behind them, the Pacific continued its business. The cliff was the same cliff it had been before they got there. The stars were the same stars. The cold air off the water did not carry any information about what had just happened. It carried salt and altitude and the impersonal freshness that open water generates regardless of what is under it. They drove back toward the city, separately, three directions. Devin Weston was in the seabed below Chiliad Mountain State Wilderness, inside a car that still had a license plate that read moneyed, and the radio had stopped playing. The Liberty Tree ran the story on a Tuesday. The headline said, "Billionaire businessman Devin Weston reported missing." The subheadline said, "Police suspect foul play." The story noted that Weston had last been seen at his Tongva Hills residence and had not made contact with associates or business partners in several days. It noted that Merryweather Security, his private security firm, described in the article as a company in which he held a significant stake, had confirmed that several employees had been found incapacitated at the property. It noted that investigators were pursuing leads. It quoted a spokesperson saying the matter was being taken seriously. It did not quote a friend. It did not quote a family member. It did not quote a single person who expressed personal concern about where Devin Weston had gone. The investigation did not produce results. No body was found at the cliff. No physical evidence was recovered that unambiguously placed the three protagonists at the scene. The moneyed plate, if identified, belonged to a vehicle registered to Weston's own holding company, which made its presence at an investigation scene into a fact about his assets rather than a fact about what had happened to them. The investigation slowed. The investigation stopped. The story moved off the front page within a week. The Liberty Tree found other material. An email arrived in Michael's inbox and in Trevor's, approximately 48 hours after the cliff. It was from Don Percival, CEO of Merryweather Security Consulting, former military man, the man who had built Merryweather into what it was and spent years watching Devin Weston treat his creation as a personal convenience. The email was brief. Percival expressed his thanks. He explained that he was now in a position to acquire Weston's 11% stake in Merryweather at a significantly reduced valuation, the kind of reduced valuation that tends to apply to holdings when the holder is no longer alive to negotiate on their own behalf and the estate is handled by professionals who did not share the original investor's enthusiasm for the asset. He indicated that he intended to make this acquisition. He also asked in the email's final line that Michael and Trevor never contact him again. He was grateful, he was satisfied, he had gotten what he needed from the situation, and he wanted it to be completely clear that the getting of it did not constitute any kind of ongoing relationship. This was the most enthusiastic response Devin Weston's disappearance generated. The Merryweather soldiers who had been on rotation at the Tongva Hills property recovered from their evening and went back to their assignments. The company did not organize any particular tribute. Percival did not give a statement about the personal loss of a valued shareholder. Merryweather continued its operations with the same institutional momentum it had operated with when Weston was alive, adjusted only for the absence of the requests that had annoyed Percival for years. Steve Haynes was dead. Dave Norton had survived the third way. He had been at the Maze Bank Arena when Michael found Haynes, but had chosen the better part of survival. He later cooperated with investigations. He was eventually quietly retired from active federal service. He was not prosecuted. He was not publicly discussed. He was managed out of the situation the way institutions manage people who become inconvenient, with the administrative equivalent of a door closing. The Western Alpha Fund, based in the British Virgin Islands, was not immediately dissolved. Holdings offshore, particularly those structured through the kind of entities that the British Virgin Islands exist to host, have their own bureaucratic lives independent of their human owners. The fund continued to hold what it held for long enough that various parties, the estate, which had no named heir in the reporting, and a small number of legal firms that had the appropriate relationships with the appropriate jurisdictions, worked through the distribution of its contents. This process was not public. The house on Buen Vino Road in Tongva Hills stood empty. This kind of property does not stand empty well. Large houses that have been inhabited by large personalities develop in their absence a specific quality, not haunted, but depopulated. The pool went untended long enough that the automatic systems kicked in, and then also went untended until the chemistry of the water changed and the surface took on the appearance of a pool that nobody is coming back to. The landscaping, which had been maintained by people who came regularly and were paid to come regularly, stopped being maintained when the payment stopped. The expensive outdoor furniture stayed where it was through the seasons because no one had instructed anyone to move it, and there was no one in residence whose comfort it was protecting. The yoga mat in the interior room stayed rolled out. The refrigerator kept its raw food inventory until the power cycling eventually rendered it inedible. The Life Invader page stayed live, still displaying the Namaste photograph, still showing the 20 miles before breakfast, still showing the golden rule about nothing over 21 in the specific stasis of a page whose curator has stopped curating. Someone posted a comment on it eventually, then several people did. The posts were what social media posts on the pages of the disappeared tend to be, some genuine, some speculative, some using the space as an audience. Nobody from his actual life posted anything. At some point in the period before GTA Online's real estate market made the property available to players, the Lost Motorcycle Club used the grounds. They were not, in the relevant sense, respectful of the property. By the time they were done with it, the house on Buen Vino Road looked like what it had become, a large, expensive structure abandoned by the person who had owned it and used, in that abandonment, by people who had no reason to treat it well. Pre-luxury, real estate eventually took it over. They cleaned it, they renovated, they rebranded it, the Tongva Estate, a name that communicated premium real estate in the hills above Chumash without specifying who had last occupied it or what that person's occupancy had looked like from the inside. They photographed it, they listed it, they priced it at the upper end of the Tongva Hills market, which was, given the square footage and the view, a number that required a specific buyer. The estate was made available for sale in GTA Online's 2025 content, at which point Michael DeSanta, who had been acquainted with the previous owner, offered a comment. If the player had not purchased the estate, Michael called the previous resident not very nice. If the player had purchased it, I hope you have better taste than the asshole who previously owned it. This is the longest epitaph Devin Weston received. No street in Los Santos was renamed, no wing of a building or hospital wing, no university library, no cultural institution bore his name as a tribute. No foundation carried his legacy forward. His Life Invader page remained visible for a while, as social media pages of the dead do, accumulating the particular web silence that develops around an account that is no longer being updated. I ran 20 miles before breakfast, then skipped breakfast. Still there. The Namaste photograph, still there. The comment about the golden rule and the 21-year ceiling, still there. And then eventually those two settled into the archive. His website listed his net worth as $12 billion and a measurement he had been confident about. Both figures were now academic. The companies in his portfolio continued. Patriot Beer continued to sell. No-Go Vodka continued to sell. The Vanilla Unicorn continued its operations. The Banner Hotel chain continued receiving guests. None of these businesses reduced their prices in his memory. None of them acknowledged a loss in their next fiscal year that referenced him specifically. They continued the way businesses continue, independent of the humans whose money initially capitalized them, sustained by the institutional momentum of entities that have acquired their own reasons to exist. Solomon Richards made another film. What does Devin Weston mean? GTA 5 is, at its structural level, a game about who gets to do what in a country organized around capital. It has multiple villains and most of them are corrupt, not in the personal moral sense of someone who made a bad choice under pressure, but in the institutional sense of people who have built their positions specifically on top of the corruption, who require the corruption to maintain what they have. Steve Haynes represents one version of this, the government employee who uses legitimate authority as a resource to be exploited for personal gain. He has a badge, a mandate, a television career. All of these are instruments of a private agenda. The badge is borrowed, the mandate is misapplied, the television career is cover. Weston represents something else, something larger in the game's argument. He doesn't need a badge. He bought the government connection. He doesn't need a mandate. He bought the army. He doesn't operate inside any institution that could be reformed or disciplined or held accountable, because the institutions he uses are the ones he has purchased, and they reflect his interests with perfect fidelity as long as the money holds. He is not corrupt in the sense of having been corrupted. He was never straight to begin with. What he is, in the game's framing, is the system operating at its logical extension, the thing capitalism produces when you remove the friction. This is what makes him different from most gaming villains. Most gaming villains want something. Power, revenge, domination, the satisfaction of a specific harm delivered to a specific person. They have goals that can be traced to motives that can be traced to a psychology. You can understand them even when you oppose them. Weston does not want anything specific. He wants the continuation of the conditions that allow him to remain what he is. He wants the money to keep moving, and the structures to keep working, and the people below him to keep doing what he needs without requiring payment or respect or the acknowledgement that they are people rather than functions. He wants the system he built to continue operating. This is the kind of want that is invisible as want. It looks, from the outside, like the world simply being the way the world is. It looks like business. Most of the people who suffer economic harm in the world do not suffer it at the hands of someone obviously evil. They suffer it at the hands of someone exactly like Weston, someone who has learned the right words, who practices yoga, who attends benefit workouts, who posts photographs in a namaste position, and who has structured their economic activities in ways that produce outcomes for other people that no one who knew the person socially would recognize in a photograph. The offshore fund. The majority stake acquired before the government contract came through. The insurance scheme that buries a film. The payment invested and never returned. None of these are advertised as cruelty. They are presented as business. Weston would tell you they were business. He would tell you the whole thing was business because business is the word that makes the thing acceptable, that converts the extraction of value from human beings into a neutral technical process that has no moral content. He is also a specifically American villain. The yoga and the wellness branding and the spiritual vocabulary layered over the financial aggression, this is a particular product of the cultural moment Rockstar was depicting. The 2010s produced a specific kind of public figure, someone who made their fortune through zero-sum financial activity and then built a public presentation using the language of positive-sum thinking, who spoke about wellness and community and giving back while their economic activity was primarily extractive, who had figured out that the wellness aesthetic and the namaste pose and the charity workout attendance served as a form of reputation laundering, that being seen practicing mindfulness made the financial practices invisible to the people who might otherwise have looked at them. Weston had this figured out 20 years before it became a recognizable cultural pattern. He was early to it the same way he was early to the internet and early to acai berry. Michael's speech at the cliff is the game making its argument explicit. Two great evils, outsourcing and offshoring. You pay people to do your dirty work and then you refuse to pay them properly because you believe the power differential makes the debt unenforceable. You keep your money out of the country and your problems out of the country and your consequences out of the country. You take from the place where the people are and give back as little as you can and store what you keep somewhere the law can't quite reach. The two great evils, spoken at the edge of a cliff above the Pacific, to a man in the trunk of his own car with a plate that reads "moneyed" as a statement rather than an accusation, because the man in the trunk already knew all of it and had simply decided it was not his problem. There is something else about the speech worth noting. Michael delivers it crouched down at Weston's level, not standing over him, not using the physical height advantage that the open trunk would have provided. He crouches. He gets to Weston's level. He speaks to him directly. This is either the instinct of someone who wants to be heard rather than to dominate, or it is something Michael didn't consciously choose and which the game chose for him. Either way, the speech is delivered not as a verdict from above, but as a statement between two people at the same height. It is the closest thing to respect that the scene contains. Michael DeSanta, retired bank robber, didn't want to humiliate Weston. He wanted him to hear a true thing before the end. Weston, in the expression he wore while Michael spoke, was running his last calculation. He called the three men who had done his dirty work slick. He said it warmly, he said it every time, as though the word were affectionate, as though the distance between what he was and what they were was a fact about the natural order rather than a fact about the arrangement he had designed. The moneyed plate. Consider it one more time. He chose that plate. It was a vanity plate, which means he filed the paperwork, paid the fee, selected the letters, and waited for the plate to arrive. He chose the word moneyed, not wealthy, not rich, not prosperous, successful, fortunate, comfortable, moneyed, the word that describes having money not as a condition of your life, but as a condition of your identity. The word that makes money the thing you are rather than the thing you have. He wanted that word on his car. He wanted it visible every time he pulled out of a gate or parked in a lot or left his Tongva Hills mansion for a morning jog to someone's house to explain that their mentor needed to be killed. He made it visible. And then it became the marking on his coffin. The car that carried the Moneyed plate is in the seabed below Chiliad Mountain State Wilderness. The plate is corroding at the rate that steel corrodes in salt water, which is slow but not reversible. The radio stopped playing at some point during the fall or on impact or in the first minutes of submersion. Los Santos Rock Radio continued broadcasting from its tower in the city, playing for its other listeners, the ones who had not gone over a cliff. It did not note the absence of one. The Pacific does not note absences. This is the thing about very large bodies of water. They predate the people who stand at their edges, and they will outlast them. And the processes they run operate completely independently of whether anyone is watching or what the people watching think about them. The cliff is still there, the stars are still there, the cold air still comes off the water in the particular way it comes off water at that altitude in the dark. The trunk is empty. The plate reads moneyed. The ocean holds everything equally and gives nothing back. If you made it to the end, thank you for staying. Devin Weston is one of those characters in gaming who is easy to dismiss. He talks too much. He is too comfortable in his wealth, too fluent in his own mythology, too casually contemptuous of the people around him. He is irritating to spend time with in the way that effective villains are irritating, not because they are cartoonishly evil, but because their specific mode of being is recognizable. You have met versions of Devin Weston, not people with $12 billion necessarily, but people who operate from the same assumptions, that the power differential determines the moral arrangement, that paying someone less than they're owed is a financial decision rather than an ethical one, that the gap between what you present and what you are can be managed indefinitely through careful self-presentation. That irritation is what Rockstar was going for. It is not incidental to the character. It is the character. He is also, and this is the detail that the game buries but that deserves to be said clearly, the only villain in GTA 5 who required all three protagonists to end him. Every other antagonist in the game met their end at the hands of a single person. Haynes died with Michael present. Stretch died with Franklin present. Wei Cheng died with Franklin present. Devin Weston died with all three of them standing at the cliff edge, hands on the car. Rockstar made a structural decision. They decided that this specific villain, the one who represented not a government gone wrong or a criminal enterprise, but the economic system operating at its unfrictionized extreme, could not be ended by one person. He required the one who planned it, and the one who captured him, and the one who made the speech, and all three of them together to push the car. Make of that what you want. There is also something in what happens after. The three men drive back to the city. Michael says they will keep a low profile and get on with their lives. Trevor says as friends. Michael says as flawed, awful, totally uncomfortable, poorly matched friends. Absolutely. And they get in their separate cars and drive separately back to the city that had been reorganized temporarily around what Devin Weston wanted from it, and which continues after him without noticeable adjustment. Los Santos does not miss him. The city has a quality, all of GTA 5's version of Los Santos has this quality of continuation. It continues regardless. The traffic continues. The radio stations continue. The pedestrians continue their lives, which involves shouting at each other outside convenience stores and jogging past mansions and making deals in parking structures. The money keeps moving. The power structures keep operating. Whatever space Weston occupied in the architecture of the city's corruption is filled quickly and without ceremony by the next arrangement. This is what the game is saying at its most honest. Not that the bad people lose, not that the system is fixed, not that what Michael says at the cliff edge resolves anything permanently, but that the specific configuration of one man's power over other people's lives, that specific configuration which seemed immovable right up until three people pushed a car over a cliff, ends, and the people it ended for go on. Franklin got a house in the hills. Michael got his family back, sort of imperfectly, in the way that families come back when enough water has gone under the bridge and everyone is tired of the alternative. Trevor got his operation in Sandy Shores and his capacity for what he is. Lester kept his basement and his systems and his specific, careful, brilliant relationship to the world. And the Tongva estate went up for sale, and someone moved in, and Michael said he hoped they had better taste than the previous owner. That is how Devin Weston ends. Not with a monument or a street name or a foundation bearing his name, but with a comment from the man who pushed him off a cliff, delivered to the person who bought his house. If there is a story on this channel you want to hear next, a character from the GTA universe or somewhere else in the worlds that games have built, there is a comment section and it is waiting. Subscribe if you haven't. The next story is already being built. For now, sleep well.